Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we're looking at two decks. We're looking at both Zedruu the Great-Hearted and Blim Comedic Genius. So these are two different decks, but they're both doing basically the same thing. They're just in different colors. So these decks are looking to donate detrimental cards over to our opponents. So to go through these, Zedruu the Great-Hearted is a 4-mana Jeskai 2/4, and you'll note, the longtime players will note that this is one of the original made-for-commander creatures. So there were a whole bunch of made-for-commander creatures when they first started printing direct commander decks, which included Mimeoplasm, Riku of Two Reflections, Kalia of the Vast, and Animar, I believe, was the rug one. No, Riku was the rug one, but Animar was in that deck. I forget what the last one was, but Zedruu was the Jeskai one. It is at the beginning of your upkeep, you gain X life and draw X cards, where X is the number of permanents you own that your opponents control. And you can play 3 mana, Jeskai colors. Target opponent gains control of target permanent you control. So 3 mana donate. And Blim, Comedic Genius, is a 4 mana Rakdos creature. It's a 4/3 flyer. And it says, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player gains control of target permanent you control. Then each player loses life and discards cards equal to the number of permanents they control but don't own. So, primary differences are obviously colors. Zedruu is Jeskai, Blim is Rakdos. Zedruu has an activated ability, Blim has to hit them. And Zedruu draws cards and gains life, whereas Blim makes them take damage and discard. So to quickly go through these, we've got our card draw, Esper Sentinel, Mystic Remora, Ristic Study, One Ring. We are technically drawing a bunch of cards with Zedruu, so if we fail to kill our opponents in any other way, we're going to lab man them out of the game. We can't necessarily count on Thassa's Oracle because we're drawing a variable amount of cards, so we always want to be able to just have lab man in play, trigger this, draw a bunch, win the game, or draw in other ways like the One Ring. Bunch of counter spells to protect our stuff. Fast mana, of course. Lightning Greaves, primarily just to protect Zedruu. Bunch of Jeskai colored lands. Protection spells to make sure Zedruu is protected, because this deck just doesn't do anything without Zedruu being in play. So Cavern of Souls to make sure it's not countered. Defense Grid, Deflecting Swat. Then we've got some Ghostly Prison effects. Ghostly Prism, Seer of Safety. We could play Propaganda, which is the blue version of Ghostly Prison if we wanted to, but I was running low on spaces in the deck, so just Ghostly Prison for now. If you're going to run one of the two, Ghostly Prison is technically better than Propaganda, because Propaganda being blue means it's susceptible to getting removed by Red Blast and Pyroblast, whereas Ghostly Prison doesn't have the same downside, although for the most part they're basically the same card. Giver of Runes and Mother of Runes, again to make sure that Zedruu doesn't die, Lightning Greaves. Peacekeeper, which does have an upkeep cost, but it prevents opponents from attacking straight out. This can't be Ensnaring Bridge, because Zedruu draws cards as part of its trigger, so we can never guarantee that we're going to be able to empty our hand. Peacekeeper is the guaranteed version of that. And then Teferi Time Raveler, again, protects our stuff, and the bounce spell isn't irrelevant either. It bounces Stax pieces or other problematic cards from our opponent. Now, do note that Teferi has a really big downside in EDH, which is that it doesn't just prevent opponents from casting instant speed during our turn, it prevents it during every turn. So for example, let's say one of our opponents has a combo that's going to win the game and we don't have an answer, like we don't have a counter spell or a way to stop that combo. Teferi will also shut down the ability for any of our other opponents to stop the combo. So Teferi does have a pretty big downside in that regard, so you do have to be careful when you use it. Then of course we've got ramp spells, much of Honor Rocks and Dockside and Ragavan, pretty stock. Then removal spells, so these are the ones we've already mentioned. Then Darksteel Mutation, which turns the creature into a no abilities 0/1 that's indestructible. And Witness Protection. Again, creature loses all abilities and becomes a 1/1. There are other enchantments that do similar things to this. Journey to Nowhere, Reprobation, etc. But again, we only have so many slots in the deck, and this seemed like enough removal. The reason these removal pieces in particular are better than cards like Swords to Plowshares is because since they're auras, we can donate them to our opponents with Zedruu, and it doesn't matter who controls them. So you Witness Protection an opponent's creature, it becomes a 1/1 that loses all abilities. It doesn't matter whether you control Witness Protection or whether your opponent does, it'll still make the creature have no abilities and be a 1/1. So we can donate them if we just want to draw more cards and gain more life off of Zedruu. Then, being Zedruu, we're not winning in combat, and we're mostly not winning with combos, so we want to Stax our opponents out of the game. So we've got all of our Rule of Law effects, and a lot of them. Arcane Laboratory, Eidolon of Rhetoric, Aethersworn Canonist, Phyrexian Censor, Rule of Law, Rest in Peace for graveyards, Deafening Silence, Drannith Magistrate, Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale. Other than these few creatures in Zedruu, we're not playing that many creatures, which means we can afford to have this. Grafdigger's Cage and Weathered Runestone to prevent graveyard stuff from coming back if we don't have Rest in Peace in play. It also prevents cheating things in with like Natural Order and whatnot. Now, you might notice that from the Rule of Law effects, we're missing one of them. We're missing Archon of Emeria, which is just straight up better in most cases than like Eidolon of Rhetoric and Phyrexian Censor, because it also makes our opponent's lands enter tapped. And the reason is because, again, like Darksteel Mutation and Witness Protection, we can donate these Stax pieces to our opponent and it doesn't matter. Other than Drannith Magistrate, which is asymmetrical, all of these other Stax pieces apply to all players equally. So we can have a Tabernacle and just donate it to our opponent. It doesn't matter who controls Tabernacle, it still applies to everyone equally. Eidolon, Rule of Law, Rest in Peace, all of these cards apply to all players equally, so we can just play Rule of Law and then donate it to our opponent, and then it doesn't matter, and we draw more cards and gain more life off of Zedruu. And then Cyclonic Rift, 2 tutors, and then we've got our Zedruu lookalikes is what I'm calling this section. So these are cards that donate things to our opponent, regardless of whether we have a Zedruu in play. So donate, Harmless Offering, just give our opponent one of our permanents. Role Reversal, exchange control of 2 permanents that share a type. And then Puka's Mischief, 4 mana enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may exchange control of target non-land permanent you control and target non-land permanent an opponent controls with an equal or lesser converted mana cost. So if we don't have Zedruu, like maybe our opponents say have a Drannith Magistrate and we can't cast Zedruu, or maybe we cast Zedruu and then they countered it or they killed it and now Zedruu costs 6 mana or maybe like 8 mana if they did it multiple times and it's just too expensive to recast Zedruu. These are just other ways of doing it. Or heck, Zedruu is kind of expensive. It's 4 mana to cast, 3 to activate. These are just cheaper ways of doing it. And then before I get to the final and the spiciest category, I'm going to move on to Blim to cover all of the same categories in the other combinations, in the other colors rather. So Blim, again, just as a refresher, we have to hit our opponents to donate things, which means we can only donate things one at a time as opposed to multiple in the same turn. And we have to also be able to attack with Blim, which means that haste is going to be a lot more important in this deck. So we've got our card draw, which is going to differ, of course, because we're in different colors. We've got Bolas's Citadel, we've got Necropotence, we've got Null Perfusion, still have the Ring, Wheel of Fortune. We've got our counter spells. This version has Burnout. We've got our fast mana, which includes the black ones this time, because we're in Rakdos colors. We've got our hasters, so Swiftfoot, Lightning Greaves, Mass Hysteria, everything has haste. Hall the Bandit Lord, if you cast a creature with it, it gets haste. And then Ashling's Prerogative. As this comes into play, choose odd or even. Each creature with converted mana cost of the chosen value has haste. Each creature with converted mana cost of the chosen value of each creature without the mana value of the chosen value comes into play tapped. So obviously here we just choose even. Our Blim has haste, and then all the odd mana value creatures of our opponents come in tapped. We could be playing some other haste cards here, but I thought these were probably the best ones, so we're just going with these. If you want more haste effects, you can add them in. Then we're going to skip this category for right now. Bunch of Rakdos lands as usual. Pretty stock, obviously Hall of the Bandit Lord. You could play Hanwar Battlement, but it's a little bit more expensive to use because you have to activate it and pay a red, as opposed to just having Hall of the Bandit Lord. But that would be another way to have haste if you wanted it. Then the rest of this is just pretty stock Rakdos lands. Then we've got our protection spells, including Bolt Bend, Ricochet Trap, and then all the same ones that we saw from Zedruu, but also Imp's Mischief in black. Change the target of target spell with a single target. You lose life equal to that spell's mana value. And then because in this version, we're Rakdos, we don't have access to the Sphere of Safety and Ghostly Prison type cards. We're playing Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs. Whenever a creature an opponent controls attacks, if you're the defending player, create a 3/3 unless that creature's controller pays 3 mana. So it doesn't prevent them from attacking you, but it does give you a blocker for free, basically. So it's kind of the same effect. We also, in this deck, cannot be playing Ensnaring Bridge because we need to attack our opponent with Blim. So if we ever went to 0 cards, we couldn't attack our opponent with Blim anymore. Therefore, Ensnaring Bridge is not viable. Then, of course, we've got our Stax cards in our removal, or all of our ramp, as usual. So, Mono Rocks, Ragavan Dockside, Red Blasts, Stax cards, which are going to differ. So in this deck, since we're only 2 colors, we can afford to play Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon, as long as we make sure that we just have a swamp in play, or artifact rocks that make black mana. We've got Dothy for graveyards, Opposition Agent for search effects, Planar Void for graveyards, Weathered Runestone, Grafdigger's Cage, and Chains of Mephistopheles to prevent extra draws. And then our sweepers, Toxic Deluge, Fire Covenant. We do have to be a little careful with this because Blim is only a 3 toughness creature. And then all of our tutors, we do get much better tutors in black than we do in Jeskai. And then the only lookalike that we can port over is Harmless Offering because all of the other ones are blue. And then finally, the most exciting cards from Zedruu and Blim, which is a category I've called Hot Potatoes. So these are the self-detrimental cards that we're going to donate to our opponents. So these cards are basically meant to either essentially kill our opponents just on the spot with the card, or significantly disrupt their game plan. So the red and colorless ones are going to be shared between Zedruu and Blim, and the other ones are going to be exclusive to one deck or the other because of specific colors. So in Zedruu's case, it's going to be the white and blue spells, and in Blim's case, it's going to be the black spells. So what do we got overlapping? Well, we've got Aggressive Mining. You can't play lands. Sacrifice a land, draw 2 cards, activate this ability only once each turn. So donate this to an opponent, they can't play lands anymore. Seems pretty self-explanatory. So what most of these cards are going to be is basically Stax cards that only apply to the player who controls them. Experimental Frenzy. You may look at the top card of your library anytime. You may play the top card of your library. You can't play cards from your hand. 4 mana destroys Frenzy. So if we donate this to a player who cannot produce red mana, we can make it so that they can never cast anything out of their hand and they're just playing off the top of their deck. This is actually surprisingly problematic when you control it, because it means you're just at the mercy of whatever you're top decking. So if you hit 2 lands in a row, you just can't play any more lands or anything else really. And it means that any cards in your hand that you were sandbagging up to that point, you also can't play. And it also means any cards that you draw off of your normal card draw for the turn don't apply. It means any cards that you're drawing from extra card draw spells like the One Ring, cantrips like Brainstorm, etc., etc., etc. None of those help you. Now, it is worth noting that they changed the mana production rules in EDH so that now even decks that don't have a red commander can produce red mana. So if a deck is playing a City of Brass, a Mana Confluence, a Lotus Petal, any of those cards can produce red mana now, but your opponent still may not have the ability to produce red mana, so this can do that. Fires of Invention, you can cast spells only during your turn, and you can't cast more than 2 spells each turn. You may cast spells with converted mana costs less than or equal to the number of lands you control without paying their mana cost. So basically this says, while your opponent's spells are now free, mostly, they can only cast 2 spells a turn and they can't cast anything at instant speed. So donate this to the control player, they have no counter spells anymore. Donate this to the storm player, they can't storm off anymore. We've got Form of the Dragon. This one is quite expensive at 7 mana, but it says at the beginning of your upkeep, it deals 5 damage to target creature or player. All right, doesn't seem bad for them so far. At the end of each turn, your life total becomes 5. Seems pretty bad for them. Creatures without flying can't attack you. So, although this might sometimes be essentially an ensnaring, or a moat basically, because it makes flyers not able to attack you, going to 5 life is really, really bad. So this is going to be a hot potato most of the time. You're just going to donate this to the opponent, although that does require that you have 7 mana plus another 3 to donate to them. Easier to do in Blim when you can just attack them immediately. And then once they're at 5 mana, it should be pretty easy to just kill them straight up. Although, do note that because this allows them to deal 5 to anything, this will allow them to shoot your Blim or Zedruu. So you do need to have protection like a Lightning Greave so that they can't hit it, or you do need to have a way to kill them immediately. Then we've got Grafted Skullcap. At the beginning of your draw step, you draw an extra card, but at the end of your turn, you discard your hand. So again, it means any cards that you couldn't get out of your hand before the end step, you're going to lose. It means if you had a bunch of cards in your hand already, you're going to lose them. It means you can't sandbag counter spells or any other form of instant speed interaction. So most of the time, even though you get to draw an extra card every turn, not being able to keep any cards in your hand is hugely detrimental. We've got Steel Golem. You can't cast creatures. Seems pretty self-explanatory. And that ends the cards that overlap between Zedruu and Blim. Oh, sorry, one more. Pyromancer's Suave. So this one's similar to Grafted Skullcap. If an instant or sorcery source you control would deal damage to a creature or player, deals that much damage plus 2 to that creature or player instead. Usually that's not going to be relevant at all. Most players are not playing burn spells. At the beginning of each end step, discard your hand. So this one's probably one of the worst ones you can give people. Like, there are some really nasty ones you can give people. So that ends the ones that overlap between the two. And then we've got the ones that are exclusive to Zedruu. So Moderation, 3 mana is Azorius Enchantment. You can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. Whenever you cast a spell, draw a card. Doesn't really matter if you're drawing an extra card if you can't cast more than 1 spell a turn. 9 lives, 3 mana hexproof. If a source would deal damage to you, prevent that damage, and put an incarnation counter on 9 lives. When there are 9 or more incarnation counters on 9 lives, exile it. When 9 lives leaves the battlefield, you lose the game. So you give this to somebody, and then you just have to damage them some amount, 9. You have to deal 9 damage to them between you and all of your opponents. Or, this does have hexproof, but there's ways of getting around that. So any type of sweeper that gets rid of 9 lives will insta-kill them. So Cyclonic Rift, Overloaded, Pernicious Deed, like, just any sweeper that cleans up enchantments or bounces them will get rid of this. And then your opponent instantly dies. So that's a pretty good one. We've got Statecraft, 4 mana blue enchantment, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt to and dealt by creatures you control. So although you can't damage any of the opponent's creatures, they also can't damage anyone else or anything else. So if your opponent was intending to win via combat, that doesn't matter anymore. It also means anyone can attack this player with impunity because even though they can block for free, all of their blocks do nothing. And then lastly, Transcendence. 6 mana, so it's expensive. You don't lose the game for having 0 or less life. When you have 20 or more life, you lose the game. Whenever you lose life, you gain 2 life for each 1 life you lost. So obviously, you have to have less than 20 life before you play this, or it will just kill you immediately, which is more difficult in Zedruu than Blim, because Zedruu gains life, but between Fetch Lands, Pain Lands, Shock Lands, Ancient Tomb, Mana Crypt triggers, etc., there are plenty of ways of getting your life total down. And the advantage of Transcendence is, unlike something like 9 lives, it doesn't have to leave the battlefield to kill your opponent. So if you donate this to an opponent who has 20 or more life, it will kill them. And then since they leave the game in multiplayer variants, so in games where you have 3+ players, if a player owns a permanent or controls a permanent that they don't own and then leaves the game, it reverts to their owner. So you donate Transcendence to a player, it kills them, it reverts back to your control. Then you just donate to the next player, kills them, reverts back to your control, donate to the next player, kill them, you win. Obviously, the biggest downside here is you do need to get under 20 life. You need to make sure that your opponents can't make you lose life, or you can't lose life yourself from any of your own life loss effects that would put you up to a life total where this would kill you. And it's very expensive, so it's kind of hard to cast and then donate this really fast, similar to Form of the Dragon. And one thing to note with both Zedruu and Blim is that they're very risky, because if you play any of these hot potato cards and then they find a way to get rid of your commander before you can donate it, you're stuck with these hot potato cards. And then you have to recast your commander or find a card like Harmless Offering to get rid of them. So in most cases, you don't want to cast any of these spells unless you either have the mana to activate Zedruu immediately after you cast it, or you can attack with Blim immediately after you cast it. Now, this deck isn't playing Academy Rector. You could sneak in an Academy Rector in here to cheat Form of the Dragon or Transcendence into play, although I think if you did that, most of the time you would just play Omniscience and then just put Omniscience out. But there are some ways of cheating enchantments in, but not many. So for the most part, I'm just leaving that alone. So that's the Zedruu side. And then Blim gets the black card. So as I said before, you obviously have access to the same red and colorless cards, but black specifically gets, and these ones are also incredibly nasty, Blood Funnel, 2 mana, non-creature spells you cast cost 2 more. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, counter it unless you sack a creature. So this is probably immediately going to just kill whoever you give it to. Not only are their non-creatures more expensive, but they also need creatures to sack in order to even get them through the counter ability. So Blood Funnel is actually probably the best hot potato in the entire deck. It's the cheapest one, and it's also one that will just straight up kill people. Then we've got Kolfiner's Plans, 4 mana. When it enters the battlefield, remove the top 7 cards of your library. So exile the top 7 cards of your library face down. You may look at and play cards exiled from the game with Kolfiner's Plans. Skip your draw step. You can't cast more than 1 spell each turn. So it enters, it triggers. You exile the top 7 face down. You can look at and cast them, or you just donate it to your opponent, in which case they skip their draw and can't cast more than 1 spell a turn. Again, in most circumstances, this is just going to straight up kill your opponent immediately unless they have a way to get rid of it. Then we've got two cards that I'll group together, Demonic Lore and Treacherous Blessing. So these are enchantments that draw you cards and then have some sort of detrimental effect. So Demonic Lore, ETB, draw 3 cards. At the beginning of your end step, you lose 2 life for each card in your hand. So play this, draw 3, donate it to your opponent. Now they lose life for having cards in hand and you don't. And Treacherous Blessing is ETB, draw 3. Whenever you cast a spell, you lose 1 life. And when it becomes the target of a spell or ability, sack it, which most things that can target an enchantment are also destroying them, so that last mode isn't that relevant. Again, play this, draw 3 cards, donate it to your opponent. Now every single spell that they cast makes them lose 1 life. Then we've got Ebon Drake, 3 mana, 3/3 flyer. Whenever a player casts a spell, you lose 1 life. So donate this to your opponent, and suddenly anytime anyone else is casting a spell, they're losing life. Do note that it's a 3/3 flyer, so it can block Blim. So whoever you're donating it to, you potentially can no longer donate anything to them after that. So that is one thing to note. We've got Lich's Mastery, 6 mana, hexproof. You can't lose the game. Whenever you gain life, draw that many cards. Whenever you lose life, for each 1 life you lost, exile a permanent you control or a card from your hand or graveyard. And when Lich's Mastery leaves the battlefield, you lose 1 life. You lose the game. So basically, it's whenever you lose a life, you have to exile a permanent or a card in your hand or graveyard, which, depending on how much life you're losing, you'll eventually run out of resources to pitch to this, which will make you have a board of nothing, and then eventually a board of just Lich's Mastery, at which point you have to exile itself, and then you lose. Nefarious Lich is similar. Quad black. If you would be dealt damage, remove that many cards in your graveyard from the game instead. If you can't, you lose the game. If you would gain life, draw that many cards instead. And when it leaves, you lose. This one is kind of different in that it's cheaper, although quad black's pretty difficult. But secondly, it doesn't have the hexproof that Lich's Mastery has. So you can just take this out in any way you want and then kill them immediately. And that is Blim's version of the cards. Oh no, it's one more card, Forbidden Crypt. 5 mana, enchantment. Whenever you would draw a card, instead return target card from your graveyard to your hand. If you can't, you lose the game. Whenever a card would be put into your graveyard, instead exile it. So basically, instead of drawing, you get to Eternal Witness, but the cards that are going into your graveyard are now exiled, and when you run out, you lose. And notably, the Forbidden Crypt doesn't get rid of itself. So again, it's a card like Transcendence, where once you donate it to someone, when they die, the control reverts back to you, and then you can donate it to someone else. So that is Zedruu and Blim, hot potato commanders. And I think while these 2 commanders are not really that good, they are hilarious. Donating game-winning, self-defeating Stax pieces or hot potatoes to the opponent to win the game with Zedruu and Blim.